Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archival. Today is the third and final video in my series on the Lost Cause myth in the Civil War in Georgia. The subject of today's video is anti-Confederate activities in Georgia's Appalachian Mountains and the Chattahoochee River Valley. So, real quick, a little bit of defining what I mean by these geographic regions. So, in North Georgia, there is a section of the Appalachian Mountains that encompasses most of the northern uh, third of the state, as you can see here on this map, that encompasses a large number of different counties. And then what I mean by the Chattahoochee River Valley, the Chattahoochee River Valley is this geographic region in southwest Georgia, southeast Alabama, and northwest Florida that encompasses the lower Chattahoochee River. All right, so with that out of the way, first we need to come to a content warning. And this is the exact same content warning that's been in the two previous videos, and that is disturbing content will be discussed in the video. Racist phrases and words will occasionally be used when reading primary source documents. The language used in these cases does not reflect the views of I, or beliefs of myself, the person making the video, and I will only be using them for educational purposes. So I do apologize for using any derogatory and racist and hateful language when reading these primary documents. All right, now let's go ahead and define the term. What is the lost cause myth? So, the Lost Cause is a romanticized and largely inaccurate interpretation of the American Civil War developed by white Southerners after the conflict that downplays the role of African chattel slavery and portrays the Confederacy as fighting for, quote, states' rights and a noble cause. The Lost Cause myth includes core ideas such as the Civil War was primarily fought about states' rights, not African chattel slavery. That the Confederacy was fighting for a just cause and its leaders were heroic figures, that African chattel slavery was a benign institution and enslaved people were happy and content, uh, as well as the fact that the one of the claims is the Union victory was due to superior resources and numbers, not military prowess. Now, this is not a completely inaccurate statement, as the United States, the northern states, did very much have more resources and a larger population to draw from for their military, but they also had very skilled generals and tacticians and developed very cunning strategies to eventually defeat the southern states and the Confederate States of America. And then finally, The Lost Cause has had a lasting impact on Southern culture and American popular memory, influencing how the Civil War and the South are remembered and commemorated. Here are some sources that I got this information from. This is by no means comprehensive. These are just three good books to start off with if you want to learn more about why the Lost Cause is a myth. Uh, Along with this, one of the main goals of this video is to address the myth of the War of Northern Aggression. Something that I have heard many times in my life in reference to the Lost Cause myth, and something that has actually come up recently in multiple comments left on my two previous videos. Um, and this is in itself a part of the Lost Cause myth, but is also in many ways its own separate myth. Though, of course, again, neither is mutually exclusive. So, what is the War of Northern Aggression? Well, it is a term used by some to refer to the American Civil War, often seen as a way to frame the conflict from the perspective of the Confederacy, with the term being used to portray the United States as the aggressor and emphasizing the Confederates' secession and the United States' efforts to preserve the nation. The term emerged during the Jim Crow era and was generally used by segregationists to connect the civil rights movement with the Civil War. And here are all the sources I got that from. as you can see here, the first three sources from the last slide are here, but also here two additional sources that specifically addressed the idea of the War of Northern Aggression and why it is a myth. Okay, so now with that out of the way, that brings us to our first section, Georgia's Appalachian Mountains and the Chattahoochee River Valley in the antebellum period. So during the antebellum period, Appalachian communities in Georgia were generally more rural and isolated than lowland Georgia communities along fertile river valleys such as the Etowah River Valley and, as we'll talk about in a minute, the Chattahoochee River Valley. Uh, because of this, Georgia's Appalachian Mountains generally had less land suitable for plantation farming, which, as a result, meant African chattel slavery was less common in the region, uh, with most Appalachian families relying on small scale subsistence farming. Though it is important to note, this does not mean that African chattel slavery was completely absent from the Appalachian Mountains. There were most certainly enslavers within the Appalachian Mountains. It was just to a far greater degree than further south in the Georgia Piedmont and the Chattahoochee River Valley and the Georgia coast, etc. The and Within this region of the North Georgia mountains, the two largest cities that were located here were first Rome, Georgia, which we talked about in the previous video, and Dalton, Georgia. In contrast, Georgia's Chattahoochee River Valley was very fertile and boasted large amounts of land suitable for plantation farming. Uh, and of course, because of that, Georgia's Chattahoochee River Valley had a large enslaved African American population. And you can actually see that difference here on this map, showing the population of enslaved African Americans really in all of the South in the United States. But specifically, we're looking at Georgia here, and you can see right here there's a far denser population, uh, a far larger population density in the Chattahoochee River Valley than there is in the Appalachian Mountains. Uh, and of course, with the plantation economy and African chattel slavery, comes the reliance on the cotton industry, which was the industry that the Chattahoochee River Valley relied heavily on, and therefore meant it relied heavily on African chattel slavery. Which, as I always have to say every time I talk about African chattel slavery was a absolutely brutal institution where anybody can be punished brutally and horrifically for any enslaved African American could be punished brutally and horrendously for any minor infraction that could happen. Well, these can include the most common punishment or the most well-known punishment, lashing or whipping, as well as other punishments including being beaten with a wooden paddle that perhaps they had spikes on it or perforations in it. Either way, as you can see here, and that would in itself be incredibly painful. And as everyone is, I'm sure who's watching, I'm sure well aware, lashing, being as brutal as it was, did leave permanent scars, like you see here. And white enslavers oftentimes actually took it further by forcing other enslaved African Americans to actually do the whipping to enslaved African Americans being punished. This was a way to demoralize all enslaved African Americans, which in itself was a way to maintain control over them. And then Another important way that the institution of African chattel slavery was brutal and horrific was that entire families would be sold away from each other. Parents would be sold away from their children, and then husbands would be sold away from their wives, and wives sold away from their husbands, parents sold away from their children, etc., etc. Absolutely horrific. Uh, in addition to this, the fertile land of Georgia's Chattahoochee River Valley also allowed many yeoman farmers to farm and gain small amounts of wealth. That being said, the majority of white Americans in Georgia's Chattahoochee River Valley were poor, and as a result, they worked primarily on small subsistence farms or in factories. And then when it comes to cities within the Chattahoochee River Valley, the largest city within Georgia's Chattahoochee River Valley was and still is Columbus, Georgia, which was actually the second largest exporter of cotton in Georgia, with the first being Savannah, Georgia. Now this brings us to the meat of our section, the American Civil War. So, after Abraham Lincoln was elected as President of the United States, the southern states, including Georgia, would secede due to Lincoln's anti African chattel slavery views. And this is talked about at length by multiple Southern politicians and Southern citizens who viewed the election of Abraham Lincoln as the president of the United States as yet another attack on the institution of African chattel slavery. We can see this, for example, in this excerpt of a resolution from the Floyd County, which is where Rome, Georgia, is located, presented by politicians named Alexander and Hardin, with Hardin actually being from the neighboring county of Cass County, also known as Bartow County. And this was a resolution that was adopted by all the constituents at the meeting. And the resolution reads, and I quote, whereas the abolition sentiment of the northern states, first openly manifested in 1820, has for the last 40 years steadily and rapidly increased in volume and in the intensity of hostility to the form of society existing in the southern states and to the rights of the states as equal, independent, and sovereign members of the Union, has led to long continued and ever increasing abuse and hatred of the Southern people, to ceaseless war upon their plainest constitutional rights, to an open and shameless nullification of that provision of the Constitution intended to secure the rendition of fugitive slaves, and of the laws of Congress to give it effect, has led many of our people who sought to avail themselves of their rights under these provisions of the laws and the Constitution to encounter fines and imprisonment and death, has prompted the armed invasion of Southern soil by stealth amidst the sacred repose of Sabbath night for the diabolical purpose of inaugurating a ruthless war of the blacks against the whites throughout the Southern states, has prompted large masses of northern people openly to sympathize with the treacherous and traitorous invaders of our country, and elevate the leaders of a band of midnight assassins and robbers, himself an assassin and a robber, to the rank of a hero and a martyr, has sent forth far and wide over our section of the Union its vile emissaries to instigate the slaves to destroy our property, burn our towns, devastate our country, and spread distrust, dismay, and death by poison among our people, has disrupted the churches and destroyed all national parties, and has now fully organized a party conjoined to a hostile section and composed even there of those only who have encouraged, sympathized with, instigated, or perpetuated this long series of insults, outrage, and wrongs, for the avowed purpose of making a common government armed by us with power only for our protection, and instrument in the hands of enemies for our destruction. So, as you can see here, within North Georgia, in the North Georgia mountains, the politicians there and Southern citizens were already very much making it known that they were seceding, or that Georgia was seceding from the United States because of Abraham Lincoln and other Northern citizens' views, specifically anti-slavery views and abolitionist views. Yes, there is a difference. Abolitionists wanted the wholesale destruction of the system of African chattel slavery. Anti-slavery individuals like Abraham Lincoln wanted the gradual destruction of the institution. And here is the source that I got this provision from here. And then if we turn to the Chattahoochee River Valley, we see similar statements being made. For example, one similar statement was made by Harbert Dent in a letter to his wife, Harbert Dent being a Eufaula, Georgia attorney, where in this letter he stated that, quote, it is absolute submission to black republicanism, black Republican rule, or absolute resistance. And then in another similar letter from Augusta Evans to her cousin, uh, Augusta Evans stated that, quote, that immediate disunion was, quote, the only door of escape from the bondage of black republicanism, and that Southerners needed to cut all ties with, quote, the waves of abolitionism that allowed Lincoln to become president. So, like in North Georgia, you can see right here, uh, citizens of the Georgia's Chattahoochee River Valley, were very much making it clear that they were going to secede, and that Georgia was going to secede from the United States because of Abraham Lincoln's anti-slavery views and the anti-slavery views of the citizens of the northern states. And as a result of this, on January 19th, 1861 CE, Georgia would secede from the United States and would eventually join the newly created Confederate States of America, also known as the Confederacy. And then on April 12th and April 13th, 1861 CE, the Confederacy would attack the United States, Fort Sumter, officially beginning the American Civil War. Now this brings us to our next section, anti-Confederate activities in the North Georgia mountains. Uh, so, uh, One thing that we need to point out is we've already sort of uh, covered this a little bit earlier in the video, is that for one thing, African chattel slavery was not, as we have already stated, it was not as common in the Appalachian Mountains as, for example, in the Chattahoochee River Valley of Georgia, due to the limited land fit for plantation agriculture. In addition to that, many citizens who lived in the North Georgia mountains largely opposed either African chattel slavery, secession, or both, as they did not rely on African chattel slavery due to the limited land fit for plantation agriculture, and also due to their opposition to seceding from the United States. This would lead many Appalachian citizens to be dubbed Unionists and they would eventually be ostracized by the Confederacy, with many Appalachian Unionists eventually joining the United States Army. And here's a picture of a secret meeting of Southern Unionists here. In fact, early on in the Civil War, many Unionists in the North Georgia mountains, would openly state their refusal to fight for what they called a rich man's war. For example, when conscription agents attempted to enlist Bartow County, Georgia citizen David Mostatter stated that he refused to, quote, fight for a rich man's slaves. Uh, and then in a letter to Georgia Governor Joseph E. Brown, Fannin County, Georgia citizen James Miller stated that, quote, we do not intend to submit to secession, which has been out of the people and has fallen into the hands of the demagogues and office seekers and pickpockets and vagrants about the towns and cities and railroads and depots. It is not the good of the citizens of our country that owns lands and Negroes. So right off the bat, multiple North Georgia citizens, were saying, "Hey, why are we fighting in a war that for an institution, African chattel slavery, that we benefit nothing from, that we don't benefit from at all?" So, and here are the sources I got that information from. Uh, That being said, other groups of Unionists in the North Georgia mountains initially enlisted in the Confederate Army. However, this began to change after the Confederate government passed the Conscription Act of April 1862 CE, which mandated the military service of all white Southern men while exempting vital operatives and, most importantly, enslavers with 20 or more enslaved African Americans. And as a result of this conscription act, many North Georgia Unionists would desert the army, which would enrage other North Georgia citizens. For example, in a letter from A.J. Reese to Nancy Wimpy, uh, um, A.J. Reese being a infantryman from Lumpkin County, Georgia, he stated that, quote, I have thought of old Isaac and how he said he was willing to shoulder his rifle anytime his country needed him. I still don't hear of him volunteering. We have too many of such patriots. And then in another letter from Augustus Boyd to his wife Fannie, Augustus Boyd stated that, quote, how hard the deserter would feel in that day when the true soldier is receiving the honor that is due to him. And then in another letter from Augustus Boyd to Weir Boyd, Augustus Boyd would applaud the strict punishment of a deserter who had a ball and chain attached to his leg, with Augustus stating that, quote, I hope he will be a warning to all deserters. Uh, in addition to that, North Georgia Unionists would also be heavily persecuted by pro-Confederate Southerners, with one North Georgia Unionist stating that conscript officers were everywhere. And I quote, conscript officers were everywhere making arrests, holding drum courts, driving whole neighborhoods of the Union men along the highways and through mountain passes and streams to the nearest conscription station or camp, here to be enrolled arbitrarily in some organization, the selection of which they were not permitted to have the slightest choice. And then in the city of Rome, Georgia, when an individual by the name of Peter Shebley was revealed to be a Unionist, he was almost killed by his brother-in-law, and an individual by the name of E.C. Hugh of Yeiser's Legion would brag that he would, quote, collar Shebley and force him to serve in the army, leading him, quote, behind a wagon like a dog. As a result, Shebley would flee into the North Georgia mountains. And here are all the sources I got that information from. And we can see further examples of and further accounts of North Georgia Unionists being ostracized and persecuted by pro-Confederate forces in the North Georgia mountains in sources such as this right here, the sketches of the rise, progress, and decline of secession, where we see the sketch here of Confederate soldiers whipping a man for expressing Union sentiments. With that account right here, talking about the various tribunals and punishments for those who expressed Union views. For example, the individual in that picture was tied to a log and had his back stripped bare and was cut all to pieces with hickories. I presume over long hours. As a result of the pro-Confederate persecution, many North Georgia Unionists would flee to the United States occupied Tennessee, where they would often join the United States Army. And you can see that this is discussed in the magazine Harper's Weekly, specifically Volume 7 for 1863, where it talks about the various refugees fleeing almost daily to Tennessee, Kentucky, and various other places. And you can see that picture here, which is the illustration that is within the Harper's Weekly magazine that I just quoted. In addition to the poor white North Georgia citizens, poor white North Georgia Unionists, many enslaved African Americans in North Georgia would also flee to the United States occupied Tennessee and would join the United States Army. One of these individuals was Owen Gideon in Gordon County, Georgia, who would be freed by his Unionist enslaver, Dr. Barry Gideon. Owen would then go on to join the 44th U.S. Colored Infantry on June 5th, 1864 CE, only for the unit to be defeated and re-enslaved by Confederate forces at Dalton, Georgia. However, Owen would escape enslavement in May of 1865 CE and would be nursed back to health by Dr. Gideon, and then he would return to his unit in Dalton, Georgia, and would later be honorably discharged on April 30th, 1866 CE. However, not everyone could flee to the United States occupied Tennessee. In more isolated parts of the North Georgia mountains, Unionists would form guerrilla bands to battle pro Confederate forces, which is discussed in sources such as this source right here, 4 Years in Secession, Adventures Within and Beyond the Union Lines, where for one thing, you have this depiction here of Union guerrillas fighting rebel cavalry. And then in Gilmer County, Georgia, Unionist leader William Clayton Fain would launch multiple raids on pro-Confederate forces. This is one of these raids is mentioned in multiple letters, with the raid being conducted by Fain in Fannin County, Georgia, on the plantation of James Morris, where Fain's men, quote, induced to leave the enslaved African Americans on Morris's plantation and other nearby farms, with Fain being seen, quote, in the company of the Negroes as they went on to the enemy, conducting them through, meaning he escorted the recently freed enslaved African Americans to the United States occupied line. And then later, Fain would attack the Magnum farm, killing the enslaver and, quote, taking his Negroes. And you can see this is the sources that I get this information from here. However, eventually, William Clayton Fain would be captured and killed by pro Confederate forces on April 6, 1864 CE. Then, on November 29th, 1864 CE, six Georgians trying to enlist in the United States Army, specifically Thomas Bell, Harvey Brewster, James T. Hughes, James B. Nelson, Elijah Robinson, Peter Paris, and Wyatt J. Parton, were executed by notorious pro-Confederate guerrilla John P. Gatewood, who was known as the long-haired, red-bearded beast from Georgia. And this event would become known as the Madden Branch Massacre. On top of this, many Georgia newspapers would praise the executions of Georgia Unionists and runaway enslaved African Americans. One example is the Georgia Journal and Messenger from Macon, Georgia, specifically the issue produced on July 20th, 1864 CE, which talked at length about the hanging of Unionists and runaway enslaved African Americans near the city of Rome, Georgia, and talks about it being a good thing and a philanthropy uh, uh, brought on by the Yankee Nation, though, of course, it was in all actuality brought on by the Confederacy. As a result of the massacres at the hands of pro-Confederate forces, many Unionists in the Georgia mountains would welcome the arrival of William Tecumseh Sherman's forces. We can see example of this in the memoir of Marcus Woodcock, a member of the Ninth Kentucky Infantry Regiment, who would state that upon entering Adairsville, Georgia, that he, quote, conversed with a quick little lad of 10 summers in Adairsville. I asked him if there were any Union men in the country. He said there were. I asked why they did not express themselves as such. He said they were afraid to. I asked why they were afraid to. He said because 2 men were hung in this town for doing that thing. Later, Woodcock goes on to state that, quote, about 100 deserters came into our lines this evening, and among them, captain and lieutenant. They said that large numbers of the enemy would desert did they not fear of some kind of retaliation for the Fort Pillow massacre. So, as you can see here in his memoir, there were quite a few people in the North Georgia mountains who were very happy, or at least, very willing to accept the arrival of William Tecumseh Sherman's forces. And now this brings us to our next section, anti-Confederate activities in Georgia's Chattahoochee River Valley. So early, much like in the North Georgia mountains, early in the Civil War, many poor white Georgians in the Chattahoochee River Valley would state their view that the Civil War was a rich man's war. For example, one unknown Georgia farmer would send a letter to the Confederate legislature stating that, quote, please give your views concerning our present condition about the war and the cause of the war. Our present condition of taxation for the support of the war Is it right that the poor man should be taxed for the support of the war? When the war was brought about on the slave question, and the slave at home accumulating for the benefits of his master, and the poor man's farm left uncultivated, and a chance for his wife to be a widow and for his children to be orphans. Now, in justice, would it be right to levy a direct tax on the species of property that brought about the war to support it? So, as you can see here in this excerpt, there was already a view developing that, again, much like in North Georgia, that why would poor white Georgians fight in a war for a system, African chattel slavery, that they benefited nothing from? However, despite the early statements about from white citizens of Georgia's Chattahoochee River Valley about the Civil War being a rich man's war, the citizens of Georgia's Chattahoochee River Valley would initially support the Confederate war effort. However, this would begin to change as wealthy white enslavers and the Confederate government would begin to hoard and confiscate resources from poor white Georgians. And this sort of shift in loyalties can be seen in letters. For example, in a letter to Georgia Governor Joseph E. Brown from Southwest Georgia farmer Frederick Burtz, which states, and I quote, "We are in great danger of subjugation to the hated government that we are resisting, not by the army of demons invading our country, but by avarice and the menial subjects of King Cotton. I hear of one planter who is pitching 900 acres in cotton. The overseer of another told me he is going to plant 300 acres, another 90 acres, another 15 hand 90 acres, another 300 acres, and two others full of crops of cotton. And so it will be all over the state. I hope Your Excellency will adopt some plan to stop those internal enemies of the country, for they will whip us sooner than all Lincolndom could do it." And here's the source that I got that from. And then in other letters, we see similar statements. For example, in a letter to the Confederate government from one farmer on the Alabama-Georgia border, which mentions how Confederate impressment gangs, quote, shot down stock, stole horses, tore down fences, and appropriated corn, fodder, and other supplies. And then in another similar letter, a Southwest Georgia farmer states that Confederate impressment gangs, quote, devastate the country as much as the enemy. So, as you can see in these letters, despite the initial willingness to support the Confederate war cause, the Confederate war effort, uh, due to the actions of the Confederate government itself and wealthy white Georgia enslavers, with those actions being as you can see here, the stealing of food, the breaking down of horses, the hoarding of resources, etc. Uh, Many poor white uh, farmers in the Chattahoochee River Valley began to no longer want to participate in the war effort at all. And eventually, urban hunger would become such a serious problem in Georgia that multiple riots would break out, with the instigators being primarily the wives of Confederate soldiers. One group of 65 women, in fact, from Columbus, Georgia, would arm themselves with knives and pistols and would march down Broad Street, raiding the stores of speculators before the police were able to restore order. With this riot being part of the broader, what are known as the Georgia Bread Riots, happening on April 11th, 1863 CE. And then to add to add fuel to the fire, many white Georgians in the Chattahoochee River Valley, who again initially enlisted in the Confederate Army, would change their minds after the Confederate government passed the Conscription Act of April 1862 CE, which mandated the military service of all white Southern men, with the exception of vital operatives and enslavers with 20 or more enslaved African Americans. and this would anger many poor white Georgians in the Chattahoochee River Valley. For example, Captain George Mercer would go on to state that, quote, "the people of Georgia find the draft disgraceful." Similarly, Georgia soldier Edward R. Hardin would write from Camp Jackson that, quote, "the army here is in great excitement. I find everybody opposed to this tyrannical conscription law." And then later on, William Andrews and 5 men from his Southwest Georgia regiment would erect a gallows, stuff a conscription uniform with Spanish moss, and hang a sign on its neck that reads, quote, conscription officer, uh, and he said that they did this to, quote, make our intentions known to them. It was never found out who done it, and that it was the last thing heard of a conscription officer coming to our camps. So, as you can see in these accounts, the conscription law and the exemption, the forcible conscription of all white Georgians, with the exception of wealthy white enslavers, very much angered the poor white Georgian communities within the Chattahoochee River Valley of Georgia. As a result of the Conscription Act, many Confederate soldiers from Georgia's Chattahoochee River Valley would desert and form guerrilla bands who would go on to attack Confederate supply wagons, raid local plantations, and would harass impressment and conscription officials. In addition to this, many enslaved African Americans in Georgia's River Valley would escape enslavement, where they would either head to the United States blockade of the Gulf of Mexico around Florida, or they would go and join up with anti-Confederate guerrillas. Uh, and after doing this, the anti-Confederate guerrillas and runaway enslaved African Americans would often hide in the Okefenokee Swamp of South Georgia. Within all of these anti-Confederate guerrilla war bands, there were two anti-Confederate guerrilla war bands that stood out amongst the rest. The first was led by an individual known as Speckled John Ward, who was the leader of one of these two largest anti-Confederate guerrilla war bands in the Chattahoochee River Valley. His band consisted of Confederate deserters and runaway enslaved African Americans, with his band becoming known as Ward's Raiders. And Ward's Raiders would go on to raid towns, Confederate supply wagons, and plantations throughout southwest Georgia, southeast Alabama, and northwest Florida. Ward's Raiders would eventually become most well known for the burning of Elba, Alabama's church on September 3rd, 1863 CE, and the Battle of Fairview, also known as Battle Branch, on September 2nd, 1864 CE, which was a battle that as you can see here on the sign, that his Raiders won. And then the leader of the other of the two largest anti-Confederate guerrilla war bands in the Chattahoochee River Valley was Joseph G. Sanders, who, after deserting the Confederate Army, would travel to the United States forces in Florida, would join the United States Army and be promoted to the rank of second lieutenant, and would then be placed in charge of the 1st Florida Cavalry. Under the command of Sanders, the 1st Florida Cavalry would raid towns, Confederate supply wagons, and plantations throughout southwest Georgia, southeast Alabama, and northwest Florida, with Sanders' most famous act being his failed raid on the town of Newton, Alabama on March 15th, 1865 CE. As a result of these anti-Confederate guerrilla war bands, specifically Ward's Raiders and Sanders' 1st Florida Cavalry, Confederate authority in the Chattahoochee River Valley of both Georgia and Alabama would collapse as Confederate officials did not would not very often enter the region out of fear of the aforementioned Ward's Raiders and Sanders' 1st Florida Cavalry, with this collapsing of Confederate authority in the region happening between 1864 and 1865 CE. And here, just for reference again, is the map of the Chattahoochee River Valley. And as you can see here, this entire area of southeast Alabama, southwest Georgia, and northeast Florida, essentially was abandoned by the Confederate government due to the actions of Ward's Raiders and Sanders' First Florida Cavalry. uh, because of this, as well as because of the brutal actions of the Confederate government, again seizing resources and hoarding food, uh, as well as the Conscription Act, many citizens of Georgia's Chattahoochee River Valley would welcome the arrival of United States soldiers led by Major General Benjamin Grierson. No, not Sherman, because Sherman actually did not enter into Southwest Georgia. He went from Northwest Georgia all the way down to Southeast Georgia. Um, and in fact, upon the arrival of Grierson's force in Eufaula, Alabama, on the Alabama-Georgia border, one of the city's residents would state that, quote, Grierson was a gentleman. With his men deported themselves without committing any depredations. And then before leaving, Grierson would actually distribute supplies to Eufaula's poor, stating that many are, quote, suffering and destitute. So, as you can see here, um, it was, the arrival of United States forces, at least to some degree, was very much welcomed by the inhabitants of the Chattahoochee River Valley during the Civil War. And here's the source I got this information from. So now this brings us to our last section. Why is the lost cause a myth? Well, for one thing, African chattel slavery was integral to the economy of Georgia's Chattahoochee River Valley. Southern citizens in North Georgia's Appalachian Mountains and Georgia's Chattahoochee River Valley stated that Lincoln's anti-African chattel slavery views were the reason for Georgia seceding. Many poor farmers of both the North Georgia Appalachian Mountains and Georgia's Chattahoochee River Valley stated displeasure in fighting in the American Civil War because they viewed the war as a rich man's war, which was started solely to defend African chattel slavery, which poor white Southerners did not benefit from. Uh, then another important thing to keep in mind is that despite the claims that the American Civil War was one of Northern aggression, poor white farmers of both the North Georgia Appalachian Mountains and Georgia's Chattahoochee River Valley stated that they felt the Confederate government was worse or at least as brutal to the Southern populace as the United States due to the hoarding and confiscation of food from poor white Southerners by wealthy white enslavers. These beliefs were further reinforced by the passing of the Conscription Act, the brutal punishment of deserters, as well as the persecution and outright massacres of Georgia Unionists by pro-Confederate Georgians. And then, because of the brutality of the Confederate government, many Confederate soldiers deserted the Confederate Army, formed anti-Confederate guerrilla bands, and chose to fight the Confederacy rather than the United States. Some, such as Joseph G. Sanders, even went as far as to join the United States Army to battle the Confederacy. Most importantly, something that does not often get talked about by people who ascribe to a lost cause is that enslaved African Americans never saw the Confederacy as the victim, and they took any chance to flee and either join the United States Army or anti-Confederate guerrilla bands to combat the Confederacy. And then in both the North Georgia Appalachian Mountains and Georgia's Chattahoochee River Valley, many poor white Georgians, though not all, of course, and all enslaved African Americans welcomed the arrival of United States forces and the defeat of the Confederacy. Taken together, these facts show that the lost cause is nothing more than a myth. And that ends our video. I hope everyone watching learned a lot and was informed by the sources that I provided. I do understand it is a controversial subject and topic, and I do to some degree have sympathies for people in the South who still believe in the lost cause myth. After all, I grew up, learning about the lost cause myth throughout public school, and was very much steeped in it. Um, and it took going to college and being shown by a professor, a history professor, the primary documents and all of the data showing that, yes, indeed, the Civil War was fought over African chattel slavery, for me to finally realize that the lost cause was a myth. Was a myth. So while I am sympathetic to some degree, I'm sorry. It's just there's just no way to go about it other than to say that yes, most certainly the lost cause is a myth. Um, so again, with that, that ends our video. If you would like to see me discuss or cover any of the subjects I mentioned in this video in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.